welcome everybody who's here with us in the room, and large numbers of people also are online. My name is Dr. Cressida Hayes, and I am the chair of the Department of Political Science. And it's my great pleasure to be opening the proceedings today for the final event of the year in our Speakers and Events series, where we are welcoming distinguished visitor, Dr. Jennifer Curtin. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're here on Treaty 6 territory. It's the traditional territory of the Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe nations, as well as being a Métis homeland. The University of Alberta respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit nations. So on behalf of the Department of Political Science, a very warm welcome. This event has been very generously sponsored by the Office of the Provost's Distinguished Visitor Fund and by the Faculty of Arts. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Abu Laban, who is the Canada Research Chair in the Politics of Citizenship and Human Rights, to introduce Dr. Curtin.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Let me say it's a really great pleasure to be able to say a few words about the University of Alberta's 2023 Distinguished Visitor, Dr. Jennifer Curtin. So Dr. Curtin is Professor of Politics and Public Policy and the inaugural director of the Public Policy Institute at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. She's a leading expert in a wide range of areas. These include electoral politics in New Zealand and Australia, populism in New Zealand, the political representation of women and Indigenous peoples, gender and political leadership, the gendered impact of COVID-19 in terms of the pandemic and related health policies, as well as the decolonization of survey research. Amongst many publications, her recent books include Populist Exception, with a question mark, the 2017 New Zealand general election, as well as the book Double Disillusion, the 2016 Australian federal election. And Dr. Curtin currently has an ongoing research collaboration with University of Alberta political scientist Dr. Linda Trimble on a SSHRC partnership development grant entitled Pathways to the Premiership, Representation, Motivation, and Impact of Women Premiers in Canada and Australia. Dr. Curtin is also an award-winning scholar, teacher, and mentor. She's held a Fulbright Senior Scholar Award and has engaged widely with a range of stakeholders, including by moderating a debate on becoming carbon neutral between the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte and then New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. She has also served as member of the OECD Gender Budgeting Expert Advisory Group. Additionally, Dr. Curtin has engaged in tremendous leadership in the profession and has served as an elected college member and now vice president of the International Public Policy Association, the chair of Research Committee 19 on Gender, Politics, and Policy in the International Political Science Association, as well as having served as president of the New Zealand Political Studies Association. And I just want to add that on top of all of this, prior to her academic career, Dr. Curtin served as a territorial soldier in New Zealand. And so she has a great deal of other skills. And I will say at a personal level, I know from being at a conference in Poland once with her that she has a perfect sense of direction and can navigate her way anywhere. I might still be lost in Poznan if it wasn't for Jennifer Curtin. So Dr. Curtin's talk today is entitled Crisis, Politics, and the Disruptive Leadership of Jacinda Ardern, Following this talk, her collaborator and co-author, Professor Linda Trimble from the Department of Political Science, will moderate questions you may have here in our live audience, as well as in our online audience that might be directed to Professor Curtin. And so without further ado, I welcome Professor Curtin to the University of Alberta and to the podium.
E nā hau, e nā tai, e nā mana, e nā reo, koutou katoa kua whakaeki mai nei. E mihi ana, e mihi ana, e mihi ana. Kei te pou, whenua Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, ngā koutou, no kouta, Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, and Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe. Tēnā koutou. Tēnā koe ki te Yasmin Abu-Laban. Tēnā koe Linda Trimble. Tēnā koe Cressida. Tēnā koutou katoa. Nā te awa o Waikato tēnei I whakatapu o. Ko Jennifer Curtin, tōku ingoa. Tēnā rā koutou katoa, ka huri aho, tōku reo tuatahi. Kia ora. Welcome, and thank you all for coming to this event this afternoon. I just greeted you all and acknowledged the elders past, present and current generations and future generations of your Indigenous peoples that I know are now known as part of Treaties 6 and Homeland of the Métis. I want to thank the University of Alberta, Yasmin, Linda, the department and the Faculty of Arts for hosting me, and to the Office of the Provost. So what I was saying to you is that my name is Jennifer Curtin, and on my mother's side, I have connections to Australia, England, and Germany. On my father's side, my forebears are Irish and Scottish peoples who immigrated to New Zealand in the late 1800s. I was born in the Waikato region of Aotearoa, New Zealand. It is the land of tribes descended from the Tainui canoe and of Te Puia Herangi, granddaughter of Tawhaio Te Wherowhero of Ngāti Mahuta, the second Māori king. Te Puia led Tainui's opposition to the government's conscription policy in World War I. She re-energized the Kingitanga movement and the economic base of her tribe, and she relentlessly demanded redress for land confiscations. Right, I'm just going to check that this is working. The Waikato has also been home. Oh, just 1 minute while I try and work out how to do two things at once. The Waikato has also been home to a number of women who have played important roles in the politics of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Some of you will recognise, some of whom you will recognise, some of whom you may not. This is Marilyn Waring, MP for Raglan, and our first gay MP elected in 1975 at the age of 23. She helped bring down a government by promising to cross the floor in support of the opposition's nuclear-free legislation in 1984, leading to a snap election. A feminist economist who wrote the famous volume, Counting for Nothing, What Men Value and What Women Are Worth. The subtext is women, children, and the environment are counted as nothing, while the international economic system calls war productive and valuable. Second is Margaret Wilson, Labour Party president, who led our first legal bid for pay equity legislation in 1989, a feminist and health and disability activist, professor of law, cabinet minister, and the first woman speaker of the House of Representatives. Helen Clark, New Zealand's second woman prime minister, head of the UNDP, after she ended her term 26 years in office as outgoing Prime Minister in 2008. She's the author of books, and she now has her own foundation and an independent policy think tank, and is still contributing to debates in New Zealand politics and policy. These three women are strong Waikato women, and alongside these Waikato women is Jacinda Ardern, who, when first elected to Parliament in 2008, at the age of 28, probably didn't think she would become Prime Minister at 37, and the subject of more than 3,800 articles in Google Scholar. You're all supposed to go, wow, at that point. Like, how many political leaders get so much academic notice, right? So Ardern was born in Morrinsville. Ardern was born in Morrinsville, yep, which is also in the Waikato, a small rural town where her mother worked in the local school and her father was a police officer. So a rural conservative place. She studied at the University of Waikato and graduated with an arts degree in communications. She was raised Mormon, later rejecting it because of its stance on homosexuality. She worked for former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark and for Tony Blair's UK government before being elected to Parliament in 2008. She was also elected President of the International Council of Socialist Youth at the age of 27. And this is the photo of her on the left when she's 27 years old after she's been elected. And the person who's in the photo with her is our current Prime Minister who took over from her, Chris Hipkins. So they were both socialists together in 2007. Ardern went on to become a list MP in our proportional system for 8 years. And she twice tried to win the marginal electoral seat of Auckland Central in 2011 and 2014. And it was Nikki Kay, who's in this photo with her, that she stood against. They were called, it was always called that, those elections were always called the Battle of the Babes, of course. She then went on to win the selection for the safe inner western seat of Mount Albert in Auckland, a seat previously held by the great Helen Clark. So my reasoning for talking about place, if you like. Oh, one thing I wanted to just say, which is on this slide, is this is from Ardern's maiden speech in Parliament in 2008. Because of her International Council of Socialist Youth membership, everybody thought she was going to be a radical. And that's what she says. Some people have asked me whether I'm a radical. My answer to that is very simple. I am from Morrinsville. Where I come from, a radical is someone who chooses to drive a Toyota rather than a Holden or a Ford. I am, though, a social democrat. I believe in what I believe strongly, the values of human rights, of social justice, equality and democracy, and the role of communities. So the importance of place. This talk I'm going to give today is a place-based, contextual, positional, New Zealand-specific, lived experience consideration of Jacinda Ardern's leadership and career as a leader. In a sense, it's an ethnographic, action research, Aotearoa, gender politics approach. So not necessarily traditionally academic or methodologically non-eclectic, but why I'm doing this is, and why I'm so grateful to be asked to come here, is that it enables me to reflect on my engagement from afar with Jacinda Ardern, but in place. And so what I intentionally want to do with you today is walk you through her leadership and her time as Prime Minister from a place-based perspective. So from a very Aotearoa, New Zealand perspective. Because I'm from the Waikato, and when I returned to Aotearoa, I taught first year New Zealand politics, And Jacinda Ardern would come to my class and speak about political life as a list MP and what it was like being a young parliamentarian. In 2017, she became my local MP. And when she won the by-election in February, before she took the leadership, she knocked on my door and asked for my vote. And because I'm a gender politics scholar, interested in institutional rules and norms and what these mean for the process of leadership, and because I'm passionate about the field of New Zealand politics, I needed to focus on place. I'm also keen to define the word crisis in context. So there are global crises that we face: climate change, financial, pandemics, geopolitical unrest. We are now being told we're in the midst of a polycrisis. But there are also local crises that political leaders need to deal with: long periods in opposition, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and economic challenges. So crisis leadership needs to fit into a particular cultural, social, political, and gendered context. So crisis leadership, in terms of the scholarship, tells us that the role of government and leaders in such times requires them to provide rapid, comprehensive, protective policy responses in ways that rhetorically and substantively straddle political divides. It's argued that they need to ensure that effective and successful solutions result while also learning policy lessons so that such threats are not repeated. So as leadership scholars have argued, crisis leadership differs from routine political leadership. In a crisis, the political stakes and reputational risks are much higher, the public is much more attentive, the mood is more volatile, and institutional constraints on decision-making may be looser. But as Ansel and others suggest, it can be easier for some leaders to master crises than to master politics as usual. Crises bring risks, but they provide leaders with a spotlight and with opportunities to expand their support base by harnessing trust and goodwill, and more substantively to build long-standing legacies. However, the body of research on crisis and political leadership, while sizable and interdisciplinary, it is largely Western in its focus. It's often written about great men by great men, and it really takes account of colonization, gendered institutional logics and legacies, and the relevance of the broader leadership group to the impact of a leader's policy impact. And so for this reason, I want to suggest that my exploration of Ardern's leadership as disruptive allows us to think a little bit differently about what counts as mastery. So I'll use the remainder of my time to focus on what I see as 6 disruptive practices that represent a challenge to 3 institutional logics that permeate New Zealand politics. Procedural logics that have been historically the norm: when Ardern won the party leadership 7 weeks out from an election, put together a coalition as the second place party, worked with both a Conservative Party and a Progressive Party in coalition, and held it together before winning the 2020 election with a majority of seats. All of those things go against the historical procedural logic that preceded Ardern. The second disruption was to some of our more informal, socially shared rules, those rules that are normally unwritten and which are created, communicated, and enforced outside of officially sanctioned channels. I'm quoting Helmke and Levitsky there. And for those of you online and here, I won't share the slides because I haven't included the appendix that has the attributions for all the photos and quotes that I've been using. And if you want those, just email me after the talk and I will send you a copy of my slides with the full appendix of references. Sorry, I should have said that at the start. So the second disruption is to these more informally socially shared rules. And arguably, Ardern disrupted a socially shared understanding of how to perform prime ministerial leadership by being a woman under 40, by having a baby in office, by communicating directly through Facebook and Instagram, showing her humanity and underscoring an appearance of accessibility and normality, on often circumventing the more hostile mainstream media. She provided command performances on traditional platforms to demonstrate political astuteness and policy knowledge and competence, and she responded to pre-pandemic crisis events using language that imparted inclusiveness and compassion. Her third disruption is that her leadership style appears to have disrupted the binary of masculine and feminine stereotypes, often represented in the media and written about at length by Trimble, Wagner, Auer, Reist, and others present in the room. And she did this by showing both emotion and rationality, by being empathetic and competent, and by performing what I call an inclusive style of populism. So the remainder of my slides are largely pictures now. You don't have to look at the top of my head while I read my notes. So I'm just going to check. Right, so disruption one. Her campaign of inclusive populism in an adversarial system, which is the norm in New Zealand. Our political system, while electoral system is proportional representation, our political system is one where two parties continue to dominate. And our house, the design of our parliament is still in a horseshoe, which means there is very little opportunity for in-place consensus politics, that if that happens at all, it's in committees. And for those of you taking photos, please don't share them on social media. So what we can see from her inclusive populism is mostly about her discourse. She talked about being optimistic. She talked about kindness. And she did this during her campaign and into her leadership once she became Prime Minister. And these are some quotes from her campaign advertisements and her following speeches. They will dismiss our optimism. They will try to convince you not to rock the boat. They will say that kindness will stand in the way of progress, but we can do better. Some might say that hope and love aren't things that government can really offer, but we can build a confident and caring nation if we include each and every person in each and every town and region. This government wants to foster a kinder, more caring society. This will involve government leading the way and facing up to its responsibilities and the legacies from the past. And these photos show, after her campaign launch, being mobbed in our local city square, photos of her engendering hope in a way that she had hoped to do. And the bottom photo is of her at Waitangi in her first outing, visiting our treaty marae, where the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Treaty o Waitangi, was signed in 1840, in which she participated in cooking sausages for all the Indigenous peoples and other guests who attended. So what she was presenting in her rhetoric, but also in her practice, was a populism that included everyone. And what we know about right populism is that it tends to create an us and them. And in Ardern's political discourse, it was always about us. There was no them. Disruption 2, crafting a coalition from second place. In proportional representation system of New Zealand, it is always the party that wins the most votes that usually gets almost always until Ardern is the one that forms the government. So I call this New Zealand's Borgen moment. Ardern came through the middle from second place and was able to form a government with a party on the Conservative centre and the Greens. She excluded the largest party, the centre-right party, the National Party, led by the guy with the voodoo doll. And of course, the coalition wasn't easy, and Labour had to trade off many of their more transformational projects to be able to get along with Winston Peters, a party who's, you know, a guy who's in his late 70s, early 80s, who's Māori, but is anti-Indigenous language teaching and the Māori seats, the reserved seats for Māori. But what she did do was span the political spectrum in a way that we have not seen before, demonstrating the maturity, I would argue, of MMP, the mixed member proportional system that we have, because this has always been its potential, and demonstrating a capacity for communication and consensus with two parties that on the political spectrum of the traditional left-right, you would never consider finding in government together. Disruption number 3, prime ministerial motherhood. So during her campaign in 2017, which was only 6 weeks long as political leader, one of the first questions she was asked as a 37-year-old woman was, well, what about if you have a baby? What are your intentions? Don't we need to know that? And this photo of her with her finger up is telling Mark Richardson off on breakfast television that these are not the kinds of questions that he could ask her, but these are not questions that can be asked of women applying for jobs, and he should just sort of get off the grass. And it was such a spectacular moment that it made The Guardian in New Zealand. This is seen as a like, whoa, we've gone global, even though there's a New Zealand version of The Guardian online, so perhaps not so much. But she did. I have a t-shirt with this image printed on it. She, you know, she became kind of locally famous just by virtue of calling out bad behavior by a famous cricket player turned journalist. She announced her pregnancy on social media, on Instagram, with the 2 fish hooks and the baby fish hook. She didn't get up in front of any cameras and do that work. The photo at the top when she's pregnant with her probably decaf cappuccino is at a rural farmer's, it's called the field days, and you go for 5 days and look at machinery and cows. So my husband and I went because he likes things farming, and there was Jacinda Ardern having her decaf cappuccino with somebody else. So I took a photo because I'm like, she's out there in her gumboots. She looks kind of pregnant, and she's talking to farmers who came to dislike her immensely over time, but that's another story. She went to Buckingham Palace in this beautiful korowai, which was gifted as a loan to her from a very kind of well-known kuia, so an older woman from one of the local Māori tribes, to wear. This is a significant gift, even though it's not to own. This is a privilege that she was clearly aware of and wore, and had demonstrated her pregnancy in a way that was very public. And pregnancy is sacred in Māori culture. And so this was seen as a very important thing for her to have done in a bicultural context. And then she has the baba and she takes parental leave. This is her at the top right is the one, her first coming out of hospital and meeting the press. The second one down is her at the UN General Assembly in New York with her partner, Clark, who didn't tell her he was bringing the baby, because the media kind of think that she's just doing it to get attention when she didn't use her baby as Neve as a prop. But the interpretation often was that might have been what was happening. So Clark took her into the UN General Assembly just before she was going to give her talk, so that she could say that she'd seen her mum give the talk as Prime Minister of New Zealand. And this is Ardern with her bub visiting a school. And you can see the absolute joy that the children have in seeing their relatively young Prime Minister visit them with baby in tow. It wasn't all love and care and thinking it was great to have only the second woman in the history of the world no, that's not right, because I got letters written to me telling me mostly from older guys that I shouldn't be a professor, because when I say she's only the second Prime Minister to have a baby in office, I was lectured to about Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth, and that there were plenty of other women who had babies in office. So what was I talking about? And what we can see here is when she announced her pregnancy, that we see sort of mixed reactions. So before she became Prime Minister, there was a poll in the local magazine about whether or not Ardern was seen by voters to be too young to be Prime Minister. And it immediately sort of followed that point about, are you going to have a baby while you're Prime Minister? That Mark Richardson had made. And you can see that most respondents thought she's old enough to be Prime Minister. And our 2017 election survey showed that at the time that young people, both men and women, think that more women should be MPs. The older they get, the less concerned about that they are. But Ardern's ability to be able to be pregnant, have a baby, and be a parliamentarian and a Prime Minister was obviously not off-putting to those who filled out our survey. However, in the newspaper, one commentator said that a woman campaigning for high office serves her gender much better if she says and does and carries the unspoken assumption that it is perfectly natural for a woman to be in contention for high office, which it is. But it did not seem quite so natural for a 37-year-old woman to be stepping into contention this week, not on account of her, but that was on account of her age, not her gender. And it's in this context, not of her age, not her gender alone, that she was asked about starting a family. So they were trying to pivot this and make it about how old she was rather than about the fact that she was able to have a child. Once she takes parental leave and then she comes back to work, and she goes to Nauru for an international summit in the Pacific, and she takes Neve with her, and that costs $80,000 for that flight. And there we have it. We have the pushback from the shock jocks that we were expecting much earlier than this, to be honest, about how it was wrong to spend such money, how the PM's baby was interfering with her job, why the baby should be costing the taxpayer, and that maybe she should just stay home and be with the baby more, because being a full Prime Minister was a full-time job. This was the narrative, and that she was a part-time PM. And New Zealand needed a full-time PM because it wasn't possible to work full-time and be a mother. So when you think that New Zealand is like, whoa, equality writ large, it's like not. And I think having a woman Prime Minister who's young and has a baby and everything else that follows really reminds us that there's still more battles to fight. Okay, disruption number 4 is Christchurch and COVID, but these are signifiers for other moments of crisis for us as well, because we had a volcanic eruption not long after the Christchurch earthquake, and COVID brought with it a number of challenges, and post-COVID too, with the economic situation around that. When Christchurch happened, the Christchurch terror attack happened, Ardern received considerable amount of media coverage. She talked publicly about it in the very first press conference that she had without naming the perpetrator. Indeed, she very rarely spoke about him at all. She talked about the people and the families, the lives that were lost, and the families who were devastated as a result. And so you'll know that the terror attack was on a mosque in Christchurch. And she said, we represent diversity, we represent kindness and compassion. We are a home for those who share our values, refuge for those who need it. And she talked about that person not having a place in New Zealand. And she was visually represented all around the world, particularly in the Muslim world, as being seen as tolerant and inclusive and focused on those who needed New Zealand's love, compassion, and sympathy and financial help, and working out ways of how to ensure something like this didn't happen again. And so she demonstrated compassion, but she also immediately put in place with her treasurer a rewriting of our budget, which was due out 2 months later, to ensure there was sufficient funds for a new gun legislation and a gun buyback scheme. And she did that within, 3 or 4 months. And people like Stephen Colbert and others in the US on talkback shows who are very keen to see gun control happen there for obvious reasons. For them, she became iconic, that she had been able to, probably not unlike John Howard in Australia, actually, a decade or so before, had been able to get legislation through to remove what we had not realised were quite lax gun laws. The second crisis that is a global crisis, so there's one local crisis here that she manages in this very authentic way that captures and seemed authentic because, not just because it's about compassion and kindness and tolerance, but because she campaigned using this language, and that language continued into government, her time in government. She didn't just use it as a tool to get elected and then drop it. She kept it going. This is just one example of when she evoked it during a crisis, and she did the same again with COVID. And so how our COVID response, I'm assuming, differed from yours. Our country was locked down. We could do that because of our geographical isolation, and we have no internal borders with other countries. Our borders were closed. People who needed to come home had to go into 2 weeks of mandatory isolation in hotels. And we were locked in our homes at different levels of allowing out for a period of months, twice in 2020, and for those of us in Auckland, again in 2021. And she again did this in ways that were expressing care. She communicated with us and our Chief Health Officer every day at 1 o'clock. You've never seen well, we were locked in our homes, so I suppose we couldn't do anything else, but we were all tuning in at 1 o'clock for the press announcement. But it was how she talked about creating a bubble that we lived in. And we had to check that the people in the bubbles next door, if people were alone, whether we were allowed to, if neighbours were alone, they were allowed to join our bubble. So this concept of a bubble became really important, and bubbles, especially for children, are not things to be scared about. Essential workers could go and work, healthcare workers, people doing necessary food supplies and other kinds of medical roles and service roles. And when we got to Easter, we were still in lockdown, and the photo there is of a young girl who wrote to the Prime Minister asking if the Easter Bunny was an essential worker, because there were some concerns amongst the children of New Zealand that they might not get their Easter eggs as a result. And she announced in her 1 p.m. press conference that yes, the Easter Bunny was an essential worker, as was the Tooth Fairy. So this sort of created a sense of care and comfort, and something that we needed to stand together on. So she was able to marshal sort of like a collective sense of we have to all look after ourselves and each other in a way that was authentic. And she used a sporting metaphor, as New Zealanders always do, which is we are a team of 5 million. So when COVID struck, our population was 4.91 or 4.93 million. And while we were in lockdown, we clocked over into 5 million people. And so the team of 5 million became the label for all of us, the signifier that we were all working together to beat this virus. And we were one of the few countries in the world that momentarily eliminated the virus. So there was a period of time in New Zealand when COVID, at least in terms of testing regime, didn't exist. Didn't last very long, but didn't exist. And we had a trans-Tasman bubble for a moment as well, which meant for those of us who have family on both sides of the Tasman, we could get on a plane. It wasn't that easy, and everybody was scared and masked and vaccinated and, you know, special forms and everything. But I got to go and see my mum and surprise her for Mother's Day. She's 84. During that Trans-Tasman bubble. The bubble was open for like 3 weeks, and then it closed again. I don't think that was the Omicron, you know, there's so many. So disruption 5, I'm conscious of time. Going global. I would say that Jacinda Ardern, from a non-academic, non-sort of like systematic research perspective, is probably our most famous Prime Minister, and probably will be for a really long time. But she took us global, not just because of COVID. She did it in a range of ways, and often New Zealanders were not aware of the extent to which her reputation was being utilised for good for New Zealand, in terms of trade, in terms of the number of trade agreements that have been signed under her watch, in terms of diplomacy. After the Christchurch attack, working with Macron, she's great friends with Trudeau. I'm assuming that's a good thing. But I think it's more about the age, right? You know, this is a new generation, at least in Ardern's case, and with Sanna, who came out from Finland, the two young women prime ministers who hung out together in Auckland, and got asked, you know, whether or not they'd be doing any girl things together, because, you know, and is that why Sanna had come? And Ardern, you know, this is now 5 years into her time as prime minister, is going like, really? Like, would you be asking John Key if the reason why Barack Obama had come to visit was because they both like to play golf, or some version of that? Don't quote me. But really, you can sort of see how some of the media is still kind of was struggling with Ardern's, you know, having such a proficient young woman leader. So Ardern put New Zealand on the map before and after COVID, and she represented an anti-Trump. This is one of the stories that got picked up by Vogue. As I said, she's done Facebook and Instagram. She's featured on a lot of magazines. And Stephen Colbert just loves her, and we love watching her on Stephen Colbert, because one of our previous prime ministers wanted to go on one of those American talkback shows to boost trade in the US, and his was completely scripted. Hers is completely off the cuff, and he came down to New Zealand, and she picked him up from the airport, and it had one of those video cameras in the car, and she did one of those things like riding in a car with Jacinda Ardern kind of things. You can see it on YouTube. And he asked when she was going to get married, and she said soon, and Stephen Colbert asked if she could be a flower girl, the flower girl. And so they have this rapport, and this is on US television. For New Zealand, you know, most people think we're Australia. So this is kind of quite a big deal, but it didn't always sit well with some in New Zealand and some in the New Zealand media. They felt she should be at home fixing the problems. And what was she doing, jetting about and being so famous? And so there's this tendency when journalists ring you up to say, well, especially when she resigned, what is it about Ardern, you know, that the international media love her so much and you guys don't like her very much? And it's like, well, it's not that binary, I'm sorry, but there's plenty of international media who didn't like her, who thought she was woke, who thought she was virtue signaling, who were really pleased when she resigned. The Australian, when she was able to put the coalition together, called her said that the losers had won. So, and the Murdoch press in Australia were awful to her throughout her term in office, and felt that it was quite fine to do that. And same with the Telegraph in the UK and other news media outlooks, who really hated the small L liberal approach to progressive politics, to climate, to being the first Prime Minister of New Zealand to attend the Pride Parade in 2018. So these sorts of things were frowned upon and seen as, you know, just her being a pretty communist and being more about stardust than substance. So I would argue that her fame overseas has been really impressive for New Zealand, and it'll be a while before people think that New Zealand is Australia again, and that she was able to demonstrate the power of being a leader who's comfortable in herself. And she evidences this most strongly with her choice of fashion labels and the way she wears them, because it's not just about putting on a designer frock or a new designer frock, but how you wear it and where you choose to wear it. So her final disruption that I want to talk about is the resignation timing. And I think people are still talking about this and writing about it. And I would just want to put it in context. I think what we have to remember is that the 2020 election was a historical win for Labour. They won majority government in a proportional representation system. At the height of a pandemic, she had kept us safe, largely safe from the virus. And she was always, the popularity and the polling could only go down. That's what happens when you get to such a high. But there were also some problems post the sort of lockdown period. So, and her own government acknowledges this. There was a lot of pushback with vaccination mandates. Well, when I say a lot, there was a noisy minority that were anti-mandate. And they took a lot of energy from the truck drivers in Canada. Thank you very much. Their protest politics really was quite strong in terms of breaching lockdown conditions and doing protests in the street and so on against mandates. The management of the borders and the reopening and letting people come home went on for too long in terms of quarantine, because we didn't have enough places and people were getting very angry about being New Zealand citizens and not being able to come home when they could and get a place in quarantine. And the vaccine rollout proved challenging, particularly for our Indigenous communities. And they didn't handle this particularly well, because despite having the largest Māori caucus than we've ever seen, and despite Indigenous peoples turning up with evidence about why the vaccine rollout needed to be done differently, they didn't listen early enough. And the vaccination rates of our Māori and Pacific peoples did not keep pace with the non-Māori population, the Tauiwi population. And this was seen as highly problematic for opening borders and so on. So it wasn't a perfect post-pandemic or pandemic management. And then with that, the protest politics have gotten bigger. The cost of living crisis has arrived. And there has been this big picture program of work that they wanted around operationalizing the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the work around Indigenous co-governance of natural resources became a lightning rod for the anti-Ardern, anti-Labour people, to the point now with the change of leadership that it's been put on the back burner, which is really unfortunate, because that was one of those transformational change policy areas that a lot of New Zealanders wanted to see happen. And it's the minority, I would argue, that are anti-Te Tiriti in this space. So when she resigned, there was also a lot of talk about she did it because of the hate that she was receiving online and the death threats. Now, there's no doubt that she faced significantly more personal threats than any of our other leaders. Police security was increased 6 times compared to other leaders. She had to cancel the Waitangi Day visit this year? Yes, a long time in advance because of risks to her personal safety. Her daughter is now 4. So it's not just her that she's thinking about when she's thinking about issues of security. And we don't even want to start talking about the online space, which I am now not in very much, because that place was really awful place to be and to watch. So on the 19th of January, I think that's the date, but I haven't written it down, she turned up. She hadn't told very many people in her caucus. She announced the election date for the 14th of October, and then she announced her resignation, saying that she would be standing down as Prime Minister before the 7th of February. So she gave 3 weeks' notice. And I would say this was a responsible option. She gave the new leader time, and she gave him the opportunity to set his own agenda, which he has done. He's gone back to bread and butter issues. There are no transformational programs on the agenda at present, although he has gone up in the polls. And she her valedictory speech, so when she leaves Parliament, is next week. So I'll be here, not there. But anyway, I've worked out how I can watch it online. If anybody wants to know how to watch it online, I'll send you the link. But by doing so, by waiting till April, she hasn't triggered a by-election, which in New Zealand can cost up to $2 million. So she's been responsible because she's leaving Parliament within the 6-month period. Ardern's leadership isn't the sole reason New Zealand was able to do what it did during COVID and be where it is now. But Ardern represents a deviation from traditional masculine norms of mastery in leadership. Her leadership helped to create, even if momentarily, a culture of collective care and compliance and limited significant human cost. And she did so in a way that generated a lot of political capital. This is her. Have I been remembering? Oh, I forgot to click it. Oh, okay, cool. So this is her resignation speech. I'm not leaving because it's hard. Had that been the case, I probably would have departed 2 months into the job. So that would have been when she was 5 months pregnant. I am leaving because with such privileged role comes responsibility, the responsibility to know when you are the right person to lead, and also when you are not. I'm looking forward to spending time with my family. Arguably, they are the ones that have sacrificed the most. And so to Neve, Mum is looking forward to being there when you start school this year. And to Clark, let's finally get married. She had to postpone her wedding twice due to COVID. I want to finish with a simple thank you to New Zealanders for giving me this opportunity to serve and to take on what has and will always be the greatest role of my life. And I hope in return I leave behind a belief that you can be kind but strong, empathetic but decisive, optimistic but focused, that you can be your own kind of leader, one that knows when it's time to go. So there were some emotional scenes in the end when Ardern gave that speech. There were, when she left Parliament for the last time, you can see the people flocking to the Parliament grounds to wish her all the best. Twitter was full of mostly positive things, but a lot of sentiments that said, who's going to look after us now? Who's going to take care of us? I'm so sad. And I got emails because I write on women in politics. I was getting emails from people I don't know saying the same thing. So when Ardern got the leadership of Labour back in 2017, with 6 weeks out from the election, with her deputy Māori leader, Kelvin Davis, the national newspaper put the quote, Labour's saviours. And what she did was she did save Labour. So I would argue when people talk about she was just running away from declining polls, I think that is an unfair final assessment of her time in power. She was the one that took the Labour Party from 23% in the polls to 36%. She was the one who navigated a coalition to get them into government in 2017. It was because they won the 2017, because they were able to form a government in 2017 that they were there when COVID happened. And we needed them there. And it was for that reason, that was the reason why Labour was able to win again in 2020. If they had not won the 2017 election, they would have not won in 2020. The virus would have still come. And we know that crises like that And having an election during a crisis, people may be conservative, not in a big C way, you know, kind of like concerned about change during a time of crisis. And so she won possibly now a third term for Labour, because she left with 9 months to go for the new leader to stamp his reputation and his leadership qualities. He is distinctively different to Ardern. The polls are up again. The Greens and Labour could form a government tomorrow. So she was strategically sensible, but she was also professional in the way that she did it. And she's looking after herself. And so we've started to see the terminology of burnout. Ardern didn't use that term. That's other people's construction of what her reasoning is. So there's been policy wins and policy losses for Labour under Ardern's leadership. She did win back the women's vote for Labour. They had lost it while they were in opposition. So that women voters had moved to the centre-right. But more broadly, I would argue she's layered a new way of doing political leadership over old institutional practices in a very short time. So kindness in politics may not be embedded, but she will be remembered, I believe, as disrupting the norms of adversarial political leadership. Thank you and kia ora.